Let's get started. Welcome, everybody, to I think, what is our sixth webinar. We started doing these at the end of 2024 and have reached over 750 people since then in these webinars. And this webinar is particularly interesting and timely. We are looking at data-driven planning for the federal wildfire workforce. My name is Marissa Christensen. I'm the Executive Director of the Climate and Wildfire Institute, and also known as CWI. CWI was formed to accelerate solutions to this era's most pressing climate and wildfire challenges. Our goal is to create faster and smarter solutions, linking together practice to research to policy to address catastrophic wildfire and other climate impacts. We do that through collaboration with many of you under a consortium model, and that means we are what we are and where we are thanks to our partners across sectors, some of whom are here with us today. So thank you for joining. In that spirit of collaboration, we're thrilled to co-host today's event with one of our close partners, Grassroots Wildland Firefighters. CWI is working closely with them in a network of researchers to offer real data-driven boots-on-the-ground solutions to some of the challenges we're highlighting here today. This includes an emerging proof of concept to assess, characterize, and provide recommendations for the wildfire workforce, driven by Grassroots' vision for change. And with that, please join me in welcoming Riva Duncan, President of Grassroots Wildland Firefighters, for a few opening remarks. Riva, please.
Thank you, Marissa. Gosh, thanks for everybody for being here today. We really appreciate it. As Marissa said, I'm Riva Duncan, and I'm the current president of Grassroots Wildland Firefighters. I had a 32-year plus career with the U.S. Forest Service, starting out in timber and then shifting my career into wildland fire. And I worked in 5 different states all across the U.S. and retired at the end of 2020 as the forest fire chief on the Umpqua National Forest in Southern Oregon. And I joined Grassroots shortly after that. But Grassroots was started in 2019 by 3 career wildland firefighters who met at a cohesive strategy workshop. And they, were frustrated with, the climate crisis, and it just felt like more and more the burden was putting on wildland firefighters. And they didn't feel like anybody was really advocating for the workforce. So they decided to start a nonprofit, and that's where we are today. We are made up of current and former career federal wildland firefighters. We feel like it's important for us to have lived the life and, worn the boots. And some of our folks are still currently employed as federal wildland firefighters. We are a largely volunteer organization. The only people who get paid is a very, very, very part-time social media expert and a legislative affairs. And so most of us do not make any money from this. Most of us hold other jobs, including myself. Even though I'm retired, I do other work. So, but you can see our pillars. We've had some really great success working with legislators, working with journalists, and working within the agencies as well, and advocating for real change. And we're continuing to do that. And we really appreciate our partnership with CWI and some of the researchers that we've hired. And we'd like to tell you a little bit about today what our next steps are. So thanks for that. And back to you, Marissa.
Thank you so much, Riva, and thank you for all the work that you all do, particularly as volunteers. It's a yeoman's work, and you are usually out in front of some of the biggest issues that often go ignored. So cheers to you and the team. Now we're going to get started. I am going to hand it off to our Deputy Director of Public Affairs, James Purini. He joined us last year as our first full-time, fully focused public policy and legislative specialist. And he's been such a wonderful addition to the team. So with that, please help me welcoming our Deputy Director of Public Affairs and Grassroots Wildland Firefighter Board Member, James Purini. Over to you.
Hi everyone. So as Marissa mentioned, my name is James Purini, and I am the Deputy Director of Public Affairs here at CWI. I'm also, as was mentioned, a volunteer board member with Grassroots Wildland Firefighters. So today I'm going to be wearing two hats. I think more importantly to me, I'm a former federal wildland firefighter. My brother is a fire management officer in federal service currently. His wife spent 15 years on incident management teams and engine crews. My other brother was a crew boss in federal service for 10 to 15 years. For people like me and the folks at Grassroots Wildland Firefighters, family and the fire community are really inseparable. For this reason, the health, the well-being, and the mission effectiveness of this community take on new meaning to many of us. Today's webinar is designed to give policymakers, advocates, and staff really a look under the hood at how agency budgeting for wildfire management has historically taken place. In doing so, we'll look at limitations in the current system, how those limitations impact operations, and then some potential data-driven solutions for the future. Before we get into all that, I just have a little bit of housekeeping to get us going. We're joined here today by two of my CWI colleagues. Cricket Baldwin and Helen Lahoda are here. They will be supporting us behind the scenes. This includes sharing relevant resources and links in the chat throughout the discussion. So please be on the lookout for those as they come through. We also encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat function will not work for bringing questions to the panel group, so please use that Q&A function. At the end of the conversation, we'll have time to answer as many of those questions as we can in the last 15 minutes. If we don't get to your questions today, please submit them to info@climateandwildfire.org or info@grassrootswildlandfirefighters.com, and we'll work to get you a response. Again, as we get into the Q&A, we'll remind you of all of this. So with that out of the way, I'm really thrilled to introduce our expert group of speakers for the day. Really a who's who of budgeting operations and planning. As Riva already mentioned, Riva retired from the U.S. Forest Service in December of 2020 as Forest Fire Chief on the Umpqua. Her career spanned over 32 years in numerous wildfire positions. Shortly after retirement, Riva joined Grassroots Wildland Firefighters Board of Directors and currently serves as our dutiful and exceptional president. She also works as an emergency management consultant with a focus on international capacity building. Dr. Dave Culkin is the principal of Culkin Wildfire Consulting and a courtesy faculty at Oregon State University's College of Forestry. Dave spent 23 years working at the Forest Service's Rocky Mountain Research Station in Missoula, Montana, resigning in April of 2025 as senior research scientist. His work integrates risk and decision science, economics, and system thinking to improve wildfire management outcomes. Dr. Chris Dunn is an assistant professor and senior researcher in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, where his work focuses on wildfire risk science and data to inform wildfire operations. Prior to his career in academia, Chris spent 8 years gaining hands-on operational experience working in wildfire suppression and fuels management. Today, his research leverages that foundational background to bridge the gap between science and management, focusing on large fire safety, response, wildfire risk mitigation, and forest ecosystem health. Finally, John Rapp, who will be starting our program right after this with a technical overview of agency budgeting, is the founder and principal of Cairns Strategic Consulting. John is also a former USDA budget director, where he oversaw more than $200 billion in annual funding and advised senior leaders, OMB, and Congress on budget, wildfire, conservation, and rural development policy. Over a 20-plus year federal career spanning USDA and NOAA, he led major efforts in strategic planning, performance management, and wildfire funding reform, including work that helped secure long-term wildfire suppression funding stability. He now advises organizations on federal strategy, program delivery, budgeting, and organizational effectiveness, focusing on natural resources, agriculture, and rural resilience. So before we get to John, we are going to get the audience involved. So we're going to start off with a quick kickoff question for the audience, and the question is here on the screen and will pop up as a poll. So from the options below, what is your biggest concern for the future and sustainability of the wildland firefighting workforce among staffing shortages and operational capacity, compensation, overtime, and retention, capacity for fuels and mitigation work, and workforce burnout and well-being? This not only helps us understand our audience, it also helps us tailor some of the conversation throughout the rest of today to your needs. So Helen and Cricket, let's give it about 30 more seconds so that we can make sure people have time to make their choice. And then let's take a look. All right, let's see what we got. Those results should pop up on the screen. Again, from the options below, the biggest concern for the future and sustainability of the workforce. Capacity for fuels and mitigation work, obviously a top concern for many. The staffing shortages, operational capacity, workforce burnout, and then compensation, overtime, and retention. Again, in making and filling out that poll, we mostly wanted to know what's on your mind today, not necessarily what you care about the most, period. We know that these are all interconnected issues, and that's part of why we're coming here together today. So without any further delay, let's go over to John, who again is our former Forest Service and USDA budget director, for a rundown on agency budgeting. So John, you want to take it away?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks to CWI and Grassroots for putting this together. I think the poll there was really interesting. I will start out with the folks on the call here by saying those have also been topics that, when I was at the Forest Service and responsible for formulation of that budget, are topics that have come up year after year, as well as at the department level as well, and balancing, various goals of agencies. And so as I talk about the budget here, and you may be saying, well, if those things have been really important, why don't we see them year after year emerging in the budget? And so I've formulated 14 president's budgets, at both the agency and department level. And while each of those are slightly different, I just wanted to give you all a flavor for like big picture of how any agency or department is going to approach a budget and how that whittles down, and why it's very difficult for ideas to really emerge out of that process. And so the biggest takeaway here for folks is that the formulation of any budget is always done within a constrained environment. So over those 14 budget cycles that I led, I think there were only about 2 years there that I could recall that guidance was ever given for having more money than the president's budget that was being considered on the Hill. And so while that's not always the way a budget comes out in the end from Congress or even, issued as the president's budget, is that really every agency is confronted during every annual cycle with a cut. Or level funding. And so most guidance that the Forest Service is going to receive on any given year is going to be take 5% off the president's budget, or perhaps go up to level with the president's budget. And they'll also be told to address various competing factors or rising costs within that budget. So most years, government has a pay raise. We say, well, you don't get any more money, but you have to wire in a pay raise. Well, you don't get any more money, but you have to pay for increasing fixed costs. Right, IT often goes up year to year. Your facilities costs go up year to year. And so within all of those, we say, now that you have accounted for those, we also want you to consider then other priorities for the administration, for the secretary, and begin to balance those. And so right from the get-go, an agency is already, aside from those things that we already just tick through that are priorities, they're already saying to themselves, well, how do we really tackle these priorities now that we're already down because we have to just budget for fixed costs here. So the best way for any agency to really gain a foothold in that budgeting process is to make sure that you're very much on the radar of the secretary. And so how any given year would have gone so far. So right now, right, we're in late May of FY26. So that means within the agencies and within the department, they're fully in formulation mode for FY28. So at this point in the year, as the department budget director, I would have issued a letter to agency heads and agency budget directors saying, here's your guidance, maybe again, 5% down. And here are the things that the secretary is interested in seeing in that budget. In past years in the fire community, it had been, let's secure a pay raise, let's secure health and wellness funding, and let's make a shift there. Broadly as a department, it may be we have to account for all rising costs for supplemental nutrition for women, infants, and children. So you can start to see that there are things that in the secretary's purview are going to be very much priorities across the board. Loan subsidy rates, things like that. They're now putting pressure throughout the entire department on how everybody is going to go about formulating. So it's really important for an agency to get that mention in the secretary's letter because without that, any real movement for a new initiative, let's say that's aside from, a couple $1 million of hazardous fuels, let's say, or forest products or FIA, things like that, you're really not going to get a strong pivot in your budget unless it's getting that mention there. And then I would say too is that what's really important here is that while an agency may get a mention in the spring guidance letter from the department budget office, there are so many processes, so many layers to go through. So obviously, if you're in that letter, that means your undersecretary is going to be aligned with the secretary. But as we look at all of those issues across the department, something may, not be the ideal amount of money or legislation, et cetera, in the budget. Has to go to OMB. They now have a full government view of pressures. You may, lose foothold there. So there are a lot of steps in the process, which I won't go into each one of them, that from the agency all the way through the White House to going through the normal appropriations process, put pressure on any idea to really go in a new direction, especially within the federal government. I'll go to the next slide. I know I'm going a little bit long. So while I could have probably a whole hour webinar on just budgeting or more than that, multi-hours, I want to point out here, especially for this group contemplating a data-driven approach to workforce or any change in this case, the wildland fire system, is that just grounding everybody in that these things do take time. And hopefully that's not throwing a bucket of cold water in everybody, but every major important movement that we've made, especially in the fire portfolio, has taken a very concerted effort. So that's fire funding fix, health and wellness, new pay tables. Um, and that effort is really dependent on the groups who will likely join this call. Um, these groups are really the ones that understand what the ideal is. So on pay tables and health and wellness, let's say Grassroots was a very vocal voice in that, in both informing the agency about what the firefighters wanted, and the agency was able to digest that, get pieces of it over time into budgets, but it was between Grassroots and other groups who also thought that this was an important path forward to be that voice of the ideal, to be the educators of Congress, to be the educators of even people in the administration who weren't quite there. Um, and I think that constant pressure here is, or not pressure, constant drumbeat, is how within the federal government we would measure success. So we need these groups to talk about where should we be, what's the goal. But as we make this incremental progress towards that ideal within the agency, they're going to consider that a success. But it's important to not lose sight of that bigger message about where we want to head. So that that is my 5 minute spiel, perhaps, about the pressures of the budget, the kind of enormity, how everything has to get weighed, and that balance that I think both the executive branch and the legislative branch and outside groups have to kind of balance and dance together to get some meaningful change in budget.
So thanks for that, John, and again, wrapping up something that you probably need a PhD in to fully understand into about 5 minutes. I think you did a really great job with that. We'll be transitioning now to a panel, but as we do that transition, John, I have one quick question as we cycle over. So before we wrap up. Many folks in this audience are focused on long-term funding stability and ensuring we protect against a return to using the 10-year average cost of suppression for out-year budgeting, which will enter us back into these fire borrowing cycles where non-fire funding was used for incident response. From your perspective, how can better workforce planning help separate the more predictable base cost of maintaining the firefighting workforce from the more variable cost of incident response so that those out-year budgets are built on actual readiness needs rather than backward-looking suppression averages? Just a very quick, what do you think of fire borrowing? Where are things
Uh,
going? And then we'll get into the panel.
um, well, I'm encouraged that one, the chief and the administration are talking about the need to reauthorize a fire funding fix. I think the important part and the intersection of this conversation with the fire funding fix is that any continuation of the fire funding fix is going to be a lot of money for government, and especially when you talk numbers that big, accountability and data become very important in the conversation. And is the Forest Service and uh, or our Forest Service and DY good stewards of money? And so this, while not squarely in that suppression budget and in the S&E budget, I think lends a lot of weight to the conversation. Is that outside the agency, the broader community doesn't see this as a blank check. They are taking it serious. They want to understand what the real needs are and what perhaps the ideal is to maybe work towards. But it's that and how the Forest Service adopts that. But it's the lens of accountability, It's the lens that there's a goal. It's the lens of how does this work in the whole system of work even within the Forest Service and others. So I think this is a piece of the conversation, but it's a really important piece for accountability and the wise use of government funds.
Awesome. Thanks for that, John. So, John will be back for the Q&A. We'll have about, 10, 15 minutes at the end, but in the meantime, we'll be joined again here with Reva Duncan, Dr. Chris Dunn, and Dr. Dave Culkin, who we introduced earlier. As a reminder, Reva is the president of Grassroots Wildland Firefighters. Dave is a wildfire research economist, and Chris is a wildfire risk modeling expert from Oregon State University. All of these folks have storied careers in their respective fields and zero opinions whatsoever. So we will now transition in what should prove to be a very uneventful and uninteresting conversation. I'm just kidding if you know these folks. Let's get started. So the first question is for all three of our panelists here, sort of reflecting on some of the kind of baseline realities that John brought forward and bringing in your perspective. Let's start with Dave, and then we can go over to Reva and then Chris. What are the most glaring information gaps for federal wildfire workforce planning? And so if we can give it just about like 1 minute, Dave, what do you think are the most glaring gaps for workforce planning right now?
I think John mentioned at the end, data. Data quality has long been a problem in fire management. There's a couple of justifiable reasons, including just the inherent interagency nature of fire response, as well as the broad range of activities, including initial attack, large fire response, severity, pre-positioning, et cetera. And these systems really haven't talked well together. When we think about the interagency nature, there was a report out from Stanford recently that showed the single largest workforce is state, local, and volunteer. And those were more than double the federal and contract resources. But how often do they show up? What functions do they serve? What is the expertise that the federal firefighters have versus others? So I think data quality is getting better. These systems are starting to talk to each other, but what we really need is the assurance that the information is available to research, to managers, and to evaluate this information while we protect the personal identification information. So data quality is getting better, but it's got to be accessible. And the system is inherently complex, and we need to recognize that. Next.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Go ahead, Reva.
Well, for me, the biggest gap is we haven't had any kind of workforce analysis done in a couple of decades now. And so there are still org charts, federal org charts in firefighting that are based on NIFMIS, which was the big fire planning effort back in the 90s, 80s and 90s. And some of those org charts are still based on that, just because it's just kind of come down that way. There was an effort again with FPA, Fire Program Analysis, in the 2000s to try to look at, again, update the staffing analysis and how many we need and where do we need them. And then that was scrapped after spending millions of dollars. And so, and even with those, when those were timely, when NIFMIS was timely, it was looking backwards. So it was using old data to look forward. And so I think we need to be, as we look at the wildfire crisis, I think we need to be very, very intentional about at least trying to look forward to see as we go into a deepening wildfire crisis, and what is the workforce, what kind of workforce do we need for that? And certainly all the things that Dave said are true as well, but that's my kind of little perspective of that.
That's awesome. Thanks for that background, Reva. We'll try and get some follow-up information on some of those prior analyses, NIFMIS, and et cetera. So we'll follow up with that for the viewers here. Chris, gaps in workforce planning.
There's nothing like going last on the panel and having to try to not be redundant. So I absolutely agree with where Dave and Reva have already taken this conversation. And so I think I'll add maybe 2 points to this and it's building off of Riva's comments about looking forward. We're in a period of really rapid change, and 20, well, maybe 30 years ago, the planning environment was a bit simpler when we were really talking about focusing on initial attack and that suppression environment at that time, and the need for run cards based on fire danger and that sort of thing. That's a bit simpler environment than having to address that plus the large fire management issues that we face today, which are far more routine and a part of our normal operating business. And that requires a completely different planning effort, a different level and number of resources and type of resources, and really blends into that interagency programmatic work that Dave was mentioning. And so as we still look forward and think about where climate change and the wildfire crisis is going to take us, we don't even have an endpoint to that. So it's going to be a constantly evolving effort. And it needs so as we enter into this, it's got to be a dynamic process that can be updated rapidly and quickly and address the needs and then diversify that needs over time. And that's going to certainly be a challenge because it's highly uncertain. And then on top of that, as we think about the workforce more broadly, we have the primary firefighters, and then we have all the secondary firefighters and all the support needs that come with that, which come from another pool of the workforce. And as we think about building out, whether it's the new wildfire management systems that are coming on board, we need to understand that it's not just the primary firefighters, it's those secondary firefighters, and those workforces need to work together well and be enmeshed in these efforts. I'll go ahead and stop there.
Yeah, so something that you mentioned, Chris, is this sort of period of rapid change. And at the risk of me sort of oversharing my personal opinion here, we are not quite at the Jetsons level of technology when it comes to wildfire management, suppression, and mitigation. And that means, in addition to everything that was shared, the health, the well-being, the security, the professionalization of the people who actually do this work continues for me to still be the most important part of solving this problem. And I think often in this period of rapid technological development, we overlook the people for the gizmos, and we really need to be focused on the people. So that's me on my soapbox before we get to our next question. And feel free to disagree with me, any of you folks that have more experience here on the call. The next question, we'll go back to Dave here. So kind of transitioning to something Reven mentioned about prior analysis. Have the federal agencies ever successfully completed a workforce planning analysis? And from your experience with the agency, Dave, what gaps did those efforts still leave in terms of both what existed then and how it's applied downstream? And why, from your perspective, do you think that those analyses haven't been replicated in recent times?
Yeah, so Riva mentioned the NIFMIS system, and initially that was based solely on timber values and slightly linked other values relative to timber. And as the agency changed, obviously that became less relevant. Early in my career, I got involved in the fire program analysis project, basically when it was floundering, to try to understand what could be done with it. And what I experienced were two primary challenges. The first, the data quality around the firefighters and the system, recognizing that state, local, municipal, and contract firefighters are really baked into the system, and we didn't have good data that recognized those positions. The other thing is fundamentally defining what success looks like. I like to talk about wildfire as a wicked problem. Essentially, as a society, we can't agree on the nature of the problem, and therefore you can't get to solutions. And with wildfire, we're going to be dealing with it forever. So it's not a one-off problem that can be optimally solved. And so what does success even look like? I think the other really challenging part about FPA and other systems where they started to be, versions of them started to be applied, like John Rapp was talking about, essentially it's a zero-sum game when we're looking at it on an annual basis. And when a system starts showing that certain areas should get more firefighters and it's going to come at the cost of other areas, it becomes very political very quickly. And that is really kind of what breaks down. I think the recognition that FPA was a very large investment, and there should be a lot of learning from what happened, what worked, what didn't work. But I think there are a lot of systems that came out of that. There were, we pulled some really important stuff from that scrap heap that are really important today. The fundamental risk assessment process that's used throughout the country and globally really came out of that work. So I would say not necessarily successful, but there were some positive things. But you've got to recognize defining success is really hard. Data quality is absolutely necessary, and it is fundamentally a political problem. So technology is not going to solve a social political problem. That was my experience.
Thanks for that, Dave. Riva, I know you've done a lot of thinking about these prior analyses. Is there anything that you wanted to add to what Dave said there?
Well, I don't know if the point has been made strongly enough, but these analyses were only looking at initial attack. So that's where I think, like Dave was saying, once we get into extended attack and large fire management, that is when we rely heavily on cooperators and partners from all over the US, right? Initial attack, we're relying on our cooperators and partners from right there, right? And cooperators. But when a large fire and we've got incident management teams, then that's a national system, right? And that wasn't looked at. It was
Riva, do you mind defining initial attack and extended attack for the audience here that might not know what those terms mean?
So initial attack is when a fire is first reported, and then usually the jurisdictional agency takes the lead. There could be, some agreements on border fires, but that is that initial action to try to suppress that fire as quickly as possible. And then once we say it escapes initial attack, that's a terrible word. But once we see that this fire is probably not going to be contained within 1 or 2 shifts, then there's a larger incident command response, and that goes into extended attack, whether it's 5 days or 5 weeks, right? It just largely depends on the complexity of that fire. So those are the differences. And so the planning in the past has only looked at initial attack because their agencies are looking within their own workforce. So that makes sense, right, at some level and with their own actual budgets. But if we're trying to look at the whole system, like Dave is talking about, gosh, we have to look at the whole system. And then, I know there are people on here really concerned with fuels management. That was not done. There was no look at prevention mitigation. We want to include that in our analysis because we feel like they all fit together and we shouldn't have a conversation about one without the other.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And sorry to run you off your train of thought there. You were cooking and I so again, as we get going, this is a really interesting discussion for those of you in the audience. Again, please feel free to link your questions there in the Q&A as we get going so that they don't slip your mind. We'll be able to get to some of those questions. I'm sure you have lots. But as we go, let's transition over to a question for Chris. Chris, we've talked about some of these different ways of thinking about analyses, and now I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you specialize in. So if you could please summarize your life's work, how can we use wildfire risk modeling and other technological advances to better define those workforce needs?
Thanks, James. I'll summarize my life's work here. But so foundational in the quantitative risk sciences, and I do want to acknowledge that in the risk science is beyond the quantitative world. It also really integrates into the social and political systems, and so it's sort of a greater reach to these, but a risk assessment can provide a foundation for decision support. And we've made really great advances over the last 10, 15 years in our ability to do geospatial analyses and assess wildfire risk. And it comes in really 2 components. There's a hazard assessment, which is really trying to address the likelihood of experiencing a fire, as well as the intensity or the magnitude of that event when it's likely to arrive. And then there's the effects analysis side. It was mentioned earlier about the NIFMIS and everything, and really focused on timber values and the protection of timber values. But we've learned over the many decades since that our forests are valued for far more than just the timber. Timber is one of those, but we also think about the impacts to communities, our critical infrastructure, our watersheds, our critical wildlife habitat, the ecosystem integrity itself, and recreation resources, among others, right? And these all form values that we then link with that hazard assessment and try to understand then how the multitude of values that we gain from our public lands are impacted by fire. And that can be both positive and negative outcomes from that. And when you do that across large landscapes like, say, Oregon and Washington, which we completed a few years ago, you start to see a diversification of where these values are present, and that opens up opportunities to tailor a workforce to meet the needs of those values and to enhance those values in the threat, in the face of a threat of a wildfire. And a lot of that comes down to using prescribed fire. You might be mitigation opportunities like thinning that supports that effort along the way, or the use of a wildland fire to meet resource objectives. And when you do these big assessments, you can start to see where those opportunities exist. And then ultimately you could tailor a workforce to drive at achieving the best outcomes in the most efficient manner. And whether that's, again, wildfire use, aggressive suppression, or mitigation in between. And with that, you can set key performance indicators that go beyond just suppression success and really start to transition this workforce towards a long-term look at how we engage and steward our landscapes with fire rather than against fire.
That sounds great. Thank you for that. Really quickly, we have a couple more questions I really want to get to before we get to the Q&A, and then we'll get over there. First, this is a kind of a follow-up here for Dave. Dave, anything that you wanted to add to that sort of thinking around analytics and how analytics can inform management? And really importantly, from your perspective, again, working within the agency on some of this, how can we translate some of the work that you and Chris do into real budgeting, real policy making, and real sort of information for the people calling the shots?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Chris ended with on key performance indicators is really critical. What we've had to date has really not met the need. And one of the challenges I brought up, just kind of the wickedness of the fire problem, how we can't agree on what success really looks like, makes it difficult. But I think we need to get more sophisticated in what we measure, and then also really understand how decision making interacts and how the decision makers interact with the information. So the best information in the world with a flawed decision process and individuals not capable of using that information is useless. So we need to have, and you brought this up, James, the person in the system. And what are their incentives? What is their background? What is the culture of decision making? And how we interact with information is so much more important than getting that next best piece of information into the system. It's how we use information. And we have to spend a lot of effort in understanding the pressures and capabilities of the decision makers in the system.
Thanks for that, Dave. So as we transition to Q&A, I have one more question. I want to give final word here to Riva. And we talked about this sort of 30,000 foot level, right? All these policy solutions and technological advances and different strategies for thinking about the workforce. I want to ground us in the reality that firefighters face, that incident management teams face, that wildfire resilience professionals face, to just really sort of root this conversation. So, Riva, we're talking about the adequacy or inadequacy of wildfire workforce planning. How does an inadequate number of personnel or resources affect on-the-ground operations during a wildfire response from your experience and career in the fire service?
Well, I think, we've been seeing it as the retention numbers, the numbers of people leaving federal workforce in fire We've been seeing that the last few years, several years actually. And to me, it's a no-brainer, but I guess maybe it's not as obvious to other people, but it certainly affects response, right? It affects how quickly we can respond. It affects efficiency and effectiveness because of the numbers of people that we might need that we don't have. So there's the end user. So if we're trying to protect communities or we're trying to protect natural resources, if we don't have enough people doing that or the right people in the right place, then we're not going to be as effective and we're not going to be as efficient. But I also want to talk about that then on the workforce, right? The workforce doesn't like that. They want to be robust. They want to be responsive. They want to do the job. And it's really demoralizing for them that the burden keeps falling more and more on top of these people trying to make ends meet, trying to stretch the system, trying to do the best they can. And I worry as someone who still goes out as an emergency hire, I worry that they continue to then take on that stress and take on that risk and may feel pushed to take on more risk to meet those, gaps. When that's not on, that shouldn't be on them. That's on management. But we know this kind of workforce. It's what we love about them. They're going to do the best they can and they're going to try to do and do and do and do. And so we're already seeing this burden really affecting the workforce. And so my worry is their physical and mental health, certainly with that.
Inadequacies create pressure. Pressure creates forced decision making influences safety and effectiveness. Is that a weird way for my brain to sum up some of that?
Well, you said it better probably than I did.
Eh, Not possible. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna turn to you, the audience, who are here with us today, and we do have about 10 minutes. So what we want to do is we want to get to as many questions as we can. We can bring back John here in case there are any questions for John if he's not already queued up. And please, again, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible. So let's give it 30 seconds to let a couple more questions load up, let you have some brain space to think, and then I'll get us started on our first question. And we already have a handful. That's great.
James, are you facilitating that?
Yeah. I'm just giving it a second so that people can queue up what they have. All right. I think that we are at a critical mass of questions. I hope that we can get to all of these. We've gotten a lot of good ones. So this is a question, it looks like for Riva and Chris from Andrea. So for, again, Riva or Chris, could you please share your thoughts on preparedness versus suppression? And I will add mitigation capacity in the current environment we're in now. So maybe we'll let's start with Chris since you're off mute there, and then we'll go to Riva.
Oh, I was gonna. So, is the question the difference between preparedness
I think
and
the thoughts
suppression?
I think the thoughts on the current setting of preparedness and suppression. So where are we at today for the coming fire season?
Oh, wow. That is a really great question, and I don't know that I have a good sense on that. I think we've gone through the fire hire, and so we're probably staffed up reasonably. I think there's a couple numbers out there that I've heard between 22,000 and 28,000. So there's a bit of a gap in the numbers that are being presented by the administration as to how much staffing is up. That would be in my understanding full staffing if we're at the 28,000 level. But there's a bit of uncertainty as to whether we're at 22 or 28, and that could lead us to having a really significant deficit in overall firefighting workforce capacity. When we start to look at the broader incident management teams, I think we're all pretty aware that we're down I would say 6 or 8 total teams at least, if not up to 10. And that's going to hinder our ability to manage the multiple large fires that typically occur in a season.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Riva, can I get 30 seconds maybe from you so we can get to a bunch of questions we got?
Well, just going kind of back to budget is preparedness and suppression are different budgets. They're different pots of money. And so preparedness is just what it sounds like. It's training. It includes training up our firefighters, their required training, critical training. It's onboarding everybody. And then it's just their day-to-day work when they're not fighting a fire. And then we switch into suppression. That's a different pot of money, and we're charging to a different code. And so when we're hiring people, we're hiring to be prepared to fight fire, right? And so that's where I think we're talking about where the staffing is. And I know there's another question about retention and recruitment and staffing, but you know, it's a moving target, and there's a lot of I don't feel there's transparency from the agencies about those numbers. So let me just leave it there.
Sounds good. Thank you for that. Let's get to another question. And this one, let's say this one's for Dave. So this is from Gotham, who asks, what specific data quality is lacking? Which specific systems don't talk to each other? And why isn't data more accessible in wildfire planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is it hasn't been emphasized sufficiently within the system, and it's complex. Government data management is hard. There are just inherent constraints in all of this. But like when you think about who shows up in initial attack, and then what Riva brought in, large fire, we're pulling from all over the place. It becomes really challenging. One of the other things I've argued is we really fundamentally don't understand the effectiveness of large fire suppression. We're not sure what activities are going on. We're not sure what activities are most effective under which conditions. A lot of the team I was leading's work at the end was looking at fire line effectiveness, and what we were finding is that less than 30% of all line built on large fires actually holds. About 35% burns over, and about 40% is built and never engages fire. Burned over line and contingency line aren't necessarily bad things. We need some of those things. You should take low probability shots if the payoff is huge. You should have contingency line if the consequence of fire escaping the primary containment is serious. But we need to be able to be better at the understanding the likelihood of where we engage fire and the success we see. And what we saw is there were certain incident management teams in certain areas that performed better than others, even after accounting for the challenges of the fire environment, both societally and fire behavior. So there's ways of really integrating this work to understand how does fire suppression actually work, where and when is it most effective, and where and when isn't it, and how do we measure those inefficiencies and address them. So that's what I would say, and I think that gets at a little bit of that KPI question.
And Dave, is that information, that research that you did, is that publicly available? Is that something we can follow up with our audience here, or send them a summary of?
So the fire line effectiveness work has been published, just the process itself. It's linked to individual team performance, incident management team performance. Hasn't been done besides anecdotally. Although we did publish a paper probably 10 plus years ago that showed that the individual incident management teams utilized resources in very different levels. And that was a paper led by Michael Hand, and I think myself and Matt Thompson were co-authors on that, as well as a few other folks. But it shows that there is significant difference in how we're approaching fires. You can also look, if you see some of these very, very large fires, you'll see every 14 days stair steps, particularly around aviation resources. And what that is each incident management team approaches each fire differently. And so we'll have a strategy building, and then we'll have an incident management team transition, and the strategy will change, and the way they use resources will fundamentally change. And we need to get more consistent about how we use resources and how we can be more effective and efficient in the use of those resources. And so we absolutely need to address the fatigue and the health issues of our firefighters. And we're going to need more firefighters so that we don't deal with that fatigue, but we can also become more effective and efficient and safer in what we ask them to do. And we need to target both of those, the capacity as well as how leadership uses these resources. Both need to be addressed because the consequences of not doing it are too severe.
That's really important. Thank you for that. I have one last question that we're going to get to. I will just note we've had very little attrition from this call today, which is a testament to the people who have joined. You all are locked in. You are dialed. You clearly care about these issues. We are grateful to you for sticking with us. And on that note, we have a mountain of questions that have come in. So for my friends here on the panel, we'll have some work to do making sure that we can respond to some of these after the conversation. On that note, I have one more question. I'm going to go back to Riva. Riva, this question comes from Alina. What do we know about attrition? Who is leaving and what are their qualification levels? Are there any considerations for making it easier for people who have left the federal service to still participate in wildfire management, maybe by reducing structural barriers to engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know that retention is a huge problem in wildland fire. It's been coming for decades. It's coming, I remember raising the alarm in 2006 when I worked in Northern California. We were warning management. We were losing the federal wildland workforce. Other wildland fire or even structure fire departments started actively recruiting and not even trying to hide it anymore. And so we started to see this, and I think we've gotten to a critical point with that. And the reasons are many, but it really comes down to, again, an unsustainable career from a standpoint of having a family, of your physical health, your mental health, because it used to be we didn't have big fire seasons every summer. And now we have huge fire seasons and it's all year round. And that burden falls strictly onto not strictly, but largely upon the boots on the ground. And, it used to be a big deal. We'd brag if we hit 1,000 hours of overtime, and now people are hitting 1,500 hours of overtime. And there's a sweet spot in there to be able to make ends meet because we still don't think the pay is enough, and so this emphasis and this reliance on overtime to survive through the year, but also, that toll that's taking on people being away from their families. And also then that's just more exposure physically and mentally, right? And so a lot of people just have left because it's not sustainable for them and their families. And what we've seen is it's unfortunately people kind of in that 10-year, 15-year. So we've invested a lot of money. They've got a lot of great experience. And that's who we're leaving because they can still start a new career somewhere else. Some get out of fire altogether. And so there's this gap in this middle leadership of, the operational workforce that we're finally starting to see the effects of. We're starting to see, people saying, well, we've got people who just don't have the experience and they're not making great decisions, right? They're making the best decision they can, but they don't have the experience. And so it's reaching a very critical point, and that's why my organization started, and that's why we're trying to look at this huge heavy lift here with this analysis of what do we need, where do we need it, so we're not again asking people to work 1,500 hours of overtime.
Yeah, thanks for that, Riva. We're at time, and I want to just close very quickly. So I will be putting on both my CWI and Grassroots hat to cover up my bald head for these last statements. So thank you to our speakers, John, Chris, Dave, and Riva, for sharing your thoughts. A few things, again, feel clear to me from the conversation. First, there's an obvious mismatch between workforce capacity and the escalating wildfire crisis, both in terms of suppression and definitely mitigation, which our audience shared as a priority. Wildland firefighters remain overburdened and undersupported, which leads to chronic burnout and attrition. Funding and planning for an effective wildfire workforce should be objective, data-driven, and free from politics. And we really can't continue to rely on 30-year-old data to make good management decisions. As a path forward, workforce planning data and wildfire risk modeling can be presented with good analytics to demonstrate, as Luke Mayfield from Grassroots Wildland Firefighters calls it, what right looks like. As always, also, the most important component is listening to our eyes and ears on the ground. These are the firefighters and wildfire resilience professionals who actually get the job done. So if you're a Hill or agency staff person joining us today from government, we recommend that you reach out to Grassroots Wildland Firefighters to discuss these issues more. They're speaking with the voice of the fire community and want to be helpful to policymakers working to make change. We'll leave contact information. We'll follow up with that. As we continue to build this programming, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on today's session, as well as other topics you might be interested in. Please take a moment, fill out the 1-minute survey once this webinar concludes. Keep an eye on CWI's website and social media for future webinar dates to come. Take a look at Grassroots Wildland Firefighters page for events that they have coming up as well. Thank you again for your attendance. Thank you again for your support. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks all, and we'll see you soon.